part.
There you go.
Excellent. And again, allow me to officially welcome everyone to the third of three parts for this listening and learning series around connecting the dots, where we've been exploring topics related to race and racism in education and in mental health. My name is Roger Harrison. I am a member of the DPA, currently serving as president-elect of our organization. I'm joined by our executive director, Kelly Wetzel, and by the chair of our diversity committee, Dr. Christina Watlington, who is waving her hands in greetings, and I see a number of familiar faces. And we have a powerful engagement. For those of you who have been here from the start, you might have remembered that we started by just exploring the history of race and racism as it pertains to our area and the educational system. And we started by highlighting that there are really only two major ways in the country that we live for human beings to move forward socioeconomically, advance, build, establish a lifetime, have something to pass on to your children, and that is education and inheritance. And for those of us who do not have inheritance, then education becomes the key. And when we have an educational system that consistently and persistently produces the same outcomes of greater impact, greater benefit for some and lesser benefit from others, then we're perpetuating harm beyond education, and it has impact for our health, for our well-being, for our length of life. And so we have some remarkable panelists who are going to, we started with our history. The second visit that we had, we explored the role of trauma, racism and race-based trauma. And this evening, we're going to be talking about restorative practices and healing. So let me just jump right on in, and I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then rather than just talking about biographies, we're going to spend some time talking about who we are as human beings and what our stake is in this game. I'm going to start uh, with Dr. Abdul Malik Muhammad, and um, he's right here for nearly 3 decades. Do the math. Dr. Muhammad has been serving both youth and adults as an educator, a transformational leader, an entrepreneur, an author, pretty committed to working with folks who are marginalized and underserved in urban areas and rural areas. He is really focused on the development of boys into men and been active in social justice, building progressive organizations. His previous leadership journeys have included being a principal, career college president, corporate director of education, regional vice president for National Mental Health Care Organization. And throughout all this time, he's launched 18 schools and specialized programs. He's led a staff of 2,400 across 11 states. He's spoken on leadership and building community across 4 different continents. Currently, he's the founder and the CEO of Akoban LLC, which is a professional development company, and Transforming Lives Incorporated, which is a provider of alternative education services. And throughout this work, Dr. Muhammad has been continuing to diligently transform lives, just community at a time. He's an author of the book, The Restorative Journey, Book One, The Theory and Application of Restorative Practices, and he's a contributing author to Colorizing Restorative Justice, Voicing Our Realities. And if you are interested in these books, I'm pretty sure that Kelly will be able to place links for those in the chat. All right, so Dr. Muhammad has his BA in International Affairs from Franklin and Marshall College, MA in Educational Leadership from College of Notre Dame in Maryland, and an EDD in Educational Leadership from the University of Delaware. He's a proud father of 2 grown people, and he lives right here in Delaware with his wife, Christina, who happens to also be right here, and their 3 dogs. All right, then we have Dr. Kira Branch. Dr. Branch, looking right there, waving at you, is a licensed pediatric psychologist and associate director of the Psychology Resident Training Program at Nemours Children's Health right here in Wilmington. She's also clinical assistant professor of pediatrics at Sidney Kimmel Medical College and Thomas Jefferson University. She received her undergrad degree from the University of Pennsylvania and doctorate from LaSalle University in clinical psychology. She's completed internship at the May Institute, fellowship at Nemours, where she currently works, and she does specialized work for children with GI concerns through a division of gastroenterology, those with chronic medical conditions, and those who are having somatic physical symptoms related to emotional functioning, psychosocial stress. She does a whole lot. She's part of the reason she's a panelist today is that she's also the clinical director of Actions Against Racism, which is a multi-tiered school-based intervention that aims to dismantle racism and promote racial healing. She's an active member of the Division of Behavioral Health Diversity Committee and very passionate about providing evidence-based, culturally relevant, culturally informed care to children and to families of color. And in 2023, which is this current year, she received the National Society for Pediatric Psychologists Award for Distinguished Contribution to Diversity. So welcome in, Dr. Branch. Last, certainly not least, we have Dr. Danielle Hachimanji, who is an assistant research scientist at Nemours Children's Health in the Center for Healthcare Delivery Science and a research assistant professor of pediatrics at Sidney Kimmel Medical College at Jefferson University. Her research and her advocacy supports the development of innovative interventions to disrupt the harm that comes from trauma, chronic stress, racism, and poverty. And she's the research director for Actions Against Racism, which I just described. She was trained at Rutgers University and Nemours Children's Health and was selected as one of the inaugural cohort members of the Castle Weisberg Scholars Program. She's a senior lab policy and practice advisor for the Social and Emotional Character Development Lab. And in her spare time, if there is that, she can be found chasing her two boys around trails and playgrounds in Pennsylvania. So welcome. And before we even get into the topic, I thought it might be important for us to share with the group here who we are in the terms of our positionality. And I don't know if Dr. Hachimanji, if I might start with you, because I read your bio last and then move to Dr. Branch and then move to Dr. Mohammed, and then we're going to jump into this conversation. So tell us about who are you?
Sure. Thank you so much, Roger. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm really delighted to take part in this panel. So just a little about me and where I'm coming from for this work. So I identify as a white cisgender female, and that affords me a lot of privileges in many spaces that I occupy. I kind of come to this work with a lens, kind of a window into experiencing inequity, experiencing kind of discrimination based on different kinds of marginalized identities. I grew up in a rural community, and I have family members who represent a lot of dimensions of kind of neurodiversity, mental health needs, and racial diversity. And so I think all of those kinds of experiences together kind of shape why I come to racial equity work. In a lot of ways, I see kind of my white identity is really central and important, just being that I think that white folks really need to step up and be a part of change if we're going to really move the needle. So to me, that's a huge motivator. And I also just am so driven by my role as a parent, just having two kids that are multiracial, but kind of depending on the space they're in, experience different levels of kind of privilege and bias. It really just kind of is very contextual for them. And it just drives me to make a world where no parents have to ever worry about their kids and worry that just because of who their kids are, they're going to be unfairly targeted, unfairly treated. It's going to affect their outcomes on education, mental health, their wellness. That to me is what keeps me going when the going gets tough, when this work is really difficult to keep. It's an active choice for me to really engage, and when I feel like a pull to maybe disengage, I think about kids, I think about my kids, I think about other kids, and it feels like not really an option for me, that I need to kind of stay engaged. So that's a little bit about my why.
Thank you. And then Dr. Branch.
Hey everyone. So I'm Kiera Branch. My pronouns are she, her. So I entered this space as like a Black cisgender woman holding a doctorate degree. So I think it's really important to share that I was born and raised in Philly, but I've worked in Delaware for the past 8 years. Since high school, I found myself in predominantly white spaces, just trying to figure out how to navigate them. And so I have not always felt like safe or valued. And so part of my why, I'm also a GI psychologist, so I believe very heavily in the mind-body connection. And so my why is, and what continuously motivates me, is just this dream that the work that I'm doing and that so many other people are doing will kind of eliminate some of the challenges that I faced, like growing up, and in the workspaces. And also, I mean, I can't say enough about the power of representation. So somehow seeing kind of my face, my story, my accomplishments might speak to kind of others and motivate them to kind of continue and jumping in on this work and kind of pursuing this field of pediatric psychology, which I feel like I said, is a predominantly white space. And so I think about that a lot in my work.
Great. All right. And Dr. Muhammad?
Yeah, good evening, everyone. I'm also excited to be here with you all. First and foremost, I'm best friend and husband to Dr. Christina Watlington. I lead with that because she has been tremendously transformative in my own life. Together, we're parents to Ngozi and Siddiqui. And then two fur babies, Layla and Prince. And all of that is all part of what we find solace, value, and an opportunity for us to de-stress as we face the world and doing the good fight, right, of trying to improve the human condition through liberation. I find myself continuously drawn towards working with folks who've been wounded by life, particularly young people, particularly children of color, particularly boys and Black boys. And so that is where I find my heart's work and where I've continued to really be interested and find some of hopefully my greatest contribution, primarily because I was and see myself as someone who has experienced the wounds of life and experiencing trauma in all of its racialized forms. I am a Black man. I'm an African man. I'm very unapologetic about my orientation and my centeredness, and so very interested in trying to find ways in which we can change not just the narrative but trajectories of the communities in which we find ourselves, wherever we find ourselves. So that's how I come to the work and sit here.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And we're just going to engage with the panel a little bit this evening. But as we're having this conversation, we really want this to just be like a room full of friends who are engaging. So as questions come up for you, as thoughts and reflections come up for you, feel free to use the chat primarily for right now. And then towards the end of this hour, we'll have folks um, um, have the opportunity to come off mute if you want to chime in by using your voice. But I guess I want to start with you. Now I'm going backwards, see how I'm doing this. Dr. Muhammad, and this idea of kind of healing and restoration. I what we started this process of these listening series over a year ago. And the first one, I don't even remember when that was. It might have been close to a year ago. But today, I cannot help but think about the heaviness that sits in the world. I cannot help but think about the pain that so many people are experiencing. We've continued to be wounded by systems of oppression, by supremacist systems, and we continue to watch people across the world also be wounded by systems of oppression and supremacist systems. And so, can I ask you, and then we'll get other panels to chime in, when you think of this idea of restoration and healing, like, what does that mean for you within the context of the harm that comes from racist systems, structures, and institutions?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's loaded and it's packed and complex, right? So um uh and what Peter Block calls the best questions are deliciously ambiguous, right? So there's that, right? So we'll chew on it together. Um I think for me, there's something that is evolving as we begin to introduce and continuously name the idea and term of harm, right? What harm affords us and invites us to do is not have to name infractions, crimes, rules, laws that are determined ultimately by those who have power and their proximity to power. What it allows us to do is have freedom to name harm. So, for instance, what goes on in the world, right, are acts of harm, um, and by centering the idea of harm as opposed to laws being broken, it gives us freedom, I think, to begin to talk about healing in ways that are different and not necessarily obligated to making large scale structural change, right? Which is important, right? We're talking about revolution there, but ultimately that at the interpersonal level, we can talk about healing and harm if we name it as harm. Harm doesn't require a law to be broken. Harm doesn't require even a large act, right? It can be subtle, it can be small. We can name it microaggression, micro insult, whatever. And so what I think we're doing is we're evolving in our understanding and our thinking. That's a good thing, as we begin to name more and more harm. And so the work that I'm doing is really thinking about how do we spend the vast majority of our time creating community, building social capital, connectedness, at such a level where those structures that we put in place, our circles, our families, our organizations, are strong enough to hold the harm that shows up, the challenge that shows up. And so for me, that's really that, right? The village itself can be strong enough to hold the harm, whatever level of harm that is. Christina is very fond of saying that, harm happens in relationships, so healing must happen in relationships. In other words, especially if we come from a culture of people where we do everything from the collective and nothing is really at the individual level, everything is really centered inside of relationships and connectedness, even connectedness with ourselves. So yeah, Roger, that's what it makes me think about. This restoration and healing is really a way to consider harm in the collective. Uh-oh, Roger, you're on mute.
Of course I am. That was bound to happen tonight a couple of times. I started to say I truly appreciate that response, and I'm gonna hop over to Dr. Branch to chime in for some thoughts. As you were speaking about harm, and I think of, yeah, one of the emphases that Robert Carter makes as he's kind of describing this kind of like idea of race-based traumatic stress is that this is not, you are not broken, you are not defective, you have experienced something that is built within the system that is doing what it is intended to do. So the problem or the defect does not lie within me. So as you were thinking about harm, as you were talking about harm, I was reflecting on that and then thinking of the beautiful saying that a lot of this is happening within the context of relationships, and so healing must happen within the context of relationships. And so, Dr. Branch, I just wanted to jump in over to you and see if you had any more thoughts, and then we're gonna like pull a little more granular details on what each of you are doing right now in your attempts to provide some kind of healing practices in response to harm.
Thank you, Roger and Malik, for your response. As you were talking, I was just thinking you were kind of focusing on harm, and it goes back to, like, for me, it's just thinking about like pain too. And I feel like with some of the work that Resmaa Menakem has done, we were talking about that difference between clean pain and dirty pain. And it's like doing this work, there's no way to avoid pain at all. But that dirty pain of kind of trying to avoid having these conversations, kind of like sitting in silence, blaming others for things, it just really prolongs the pain. But that clean pain where we're actually working through pain, engaging in conflict, and discussing with each other, moving towards with each other to kind of like do this work, it really promotes that healing. I really agree with that. The statement that healing really comes from a collective, and so that need for social support and doing this work is key. And thinking about what social support does look like and what your village looks like. It looks different for like different things too. And so I believe wholly in the power of affinity spaces. And I think with doing this work too, for individuals who hold more privilege or might hold white identities, is thinking about not placing some of the additional burden or strain by going to your friends and colleagues of color to kind of like educate and do the work with you. I think that is something we have to be keeping in mind as we're thinking about healing too. Well, those were just my thoughts. We're thinking about that harm and the relationship with healing and pain.
Yeah, and Dr. Hachimanji, I'm gonna keep going because again, every response just gets my brain going and I can't help it. But I can't think that many of us have been trained in a very kind of like European kind of Western idea of healing, but we've also been trained in fields, particular the behavioral health fields, that have largely ignored this kind of pain and this kind of harm. And so, as someone who primarily is oriented, like as a researcher, just thoughts on what does that mean for us to move forward? And I'm reading a bio that says evidence based, but we operate in fields, for those of us who are doing kind of clinical care, where this field has largely ignored this kind of harm throughout its entire history. So I don't know if that's a question, but I'd love for you to just share your thoughts and your response to that as we're navigating now terrain of promoting healing both for young folks and folks who aren't that young anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to your question about kind of evidence base and right, my primary role is a researcher. What I've been saying a lot about this work, and we do a lot of work in schools, is that a lot of times in research, we talk about a research practice gap where the research is so great and it's just not getting to practice. But honestly, my belief is that there's a practice research gap in this work. And that so I am trying to take a more and more humble stance. I think the more I learn that I don't know, that there is so much out there in practice that is not documented in research. And when we say evidence-based, we mean documented in research. But that doesn't make sense in this situation, because there are tons and tons of practitioners, of educators, of community organizations, of equity trainers. There's just so many people out there doing this good work that's just not captured in the way that when we use the words evidence-based, that's what we're talking about. So I think that in terms of kind of like directions for research, that's kind of a big thing that's driving me, is to understand what's currently going on. What are people doing that's working? And what do schools need? What do school systems, what do health care systems need to disrupt racism? And not try to reinvent the wheel, but to figure out what is the wheel, and let's teach this, to like spread this knowledge, to help share and disseminate the good stuff, uplift, kind of amplify the good work that's going on. But I don't think that it's not necessarily not happening, which is what you might think if you were trying to rely on those words, evidence-based.
Beautifully spoken. Again, listening to you, the first thought that came to my head in response is how we are trapped in these systems that are dominated by whiteness. And as a principle, if it is not written, it is not real. And so if we cannot pull it from a journal, for example, then we tend to discount it, even though there's so much powerful evidence and powerful wisdom that lives in the body of people who've experienced it, who've had to figure out their way for their own survival, to heal themselves from the harm from racism. And so it just your response just made me think of how kind of perverse the system is, because it only values a type of experience, and that experience itself, the experience of research, has largely been gate kept by folks who didn't let everyone in there. And so I'm going to move back over now to Dr. Mohammed and maybe have you share with us in a little bit more kind of granular detail. What are some of the initiatives, the programs, the practices that you have been a part of that are geared towards restoration and geared towards healing? And then I shifted back to our other two panelists to talk about their program that you can also see in their backgrounds.
Yeah. I mean, just this notion, Danielle, that you bring up around evidence-based practice, what we've been hearing and thinking about a lot is this notion of practice-based evidence, right? So what is the field? What is the work really informing us? And that is also a worthy piece of evidence as well. And we've been thinking about what is an equity frame that we can even look at data. And what we've been thinking about is this notion of and introducing into the work is this notion of sort of this triple lens by which we can look at data, right? So implementation, outcomes, and impact. And by looking at that, we're able to ask questions around what metrics matter and to whom do they matter, right? So in the context of schools, right? So we use the analogy of the bicycle, right? Teaching someone how to ride a bike is implementation, right? Riding and clocking the number of miles is the outcomes, right? But that we're measuring, what it's doing to your heart and heart rate, right, is impact, right? So the problem is that we've got these initiatives all across the board that really are incongruent with impact and outcomes. We're looking at some of the bigger, larger outcome data, but not looking at impact, nor are we even doing the thing correctly. So for what our organizations, Aquaben and Transforming Lives, are really looking at doing and thinking about doing and are doing is really our work centered around 4 pillars: restorative practices, trauma-informed practices, equity or cultural relevancy, and then strengths-based or agency and assets. So those 4 pillars hold up our work. With Aquaben really looking at training, consulting, and coaching. And so we work with primarily about 90% of our work in Aquaben is with schools, K-12 schools, where we're doing things called Ujima projects. And what that is we're really trying to move the needle in implementation of say restorative practices, but also its marriage to equity and trauma-informed practices. What we have in many schools and beyond are folks that have training, say in restorative practices, but they've left that training, never once questioned bias, privilege, power, supremacy, right? And so for me, there's a dishonor of the microphone when we've actually had training but haven't allowed it to really push the needle in which it needs. So that's really what the space on the battlefield that we're trying to offer. That's in Aquaben, and on TLI, we're trying to implement that with the most misunderstood, misrecognized young people, those in alternative schools, which are predominantly Black and brown, predominantly boys. And so TLI is really trying to put that work in practice, where Aquaben is really coaching, training around that work as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And again, as we go into this, if you're here and you're not a panelist and you have a thought, you have a reflection, you have a question for this moment, please place those in the chat and we'll try to engage them as we go along, because I'm going to turn it back over to Drs. Branch and Hetchimanji to figure out how together you're going to share with us what Actions Against Racism is and how you see this intervention playing a role in restoration and healing for younger children, or any child, I suppose.
Yeah, I can start us off, and I'll leave it to Danielle. I feel like we have a good spiel that kind of comes up from doing this presentation multiple times. So Actions Against Racism started, the idea of Actions Against Racism, I'll say, started in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd, where I brought just our diversity advisor and our division chief at Nemours, the idea of an intervention to kind of help support individuals with minority or minoritized backgrounds heal and cope with the stress and harm of racial encounters. During our discussions, we also just started to incorporate components for white folks who kind of wanted to be allies. So at Nemours, we kind of like started developing content just based on this evidence-based practice. So thinking about trauma-informed care, like racial socialization, social emotional learning, and kind of anti-racism. Our community engagement office at Nemours actually hooked us up with this pilot school, Eastside Charter School, that has really worked with us a lot during this intervention development. And so we turned it, while we started thinking of it as a community program, we turned it into a school-based program, just knowing that a lot of our kids spend 7 to 8 hours a day in schools. And we find that there's not a lot of research or kind of literature or practices about having these discussions and racial socialization in school systems. And so we thought that was a gap that needed to be addressed, especially because they are spending most of their time in schools. And so we, with Actions Against Racism, I will just have to put out there that, because you can't read it on our logo, we came up with like 5 different actions that were kind of like putting our intervention under. So talking about racism, recognizing racism, disrupting racism, coping with racism, and repairing harm and healing from racism. And so far we conceptualized it as a multi-tier kind of intervention, but we felt like we couldn't really work with children and families first on doing these things. And so we focused the intervention so far on just doing things with the school, the educators and the leadership, and creating these professional development things to walk through these different actions and give them practice with moving their jaws and having these conversations. And so I will leave it to kind of like Danielle to talk about some of the research things that's been happening related to that.
Sure, and I mean, as we've piloted, I think we've become increasingly aware of the importance of focusing on the adults in this space. And this is kind of a movement that's echoed in different places in education right now, which is kind of caring for the mental health, the social emotional competencies, the trainings that educators receive, actually putting them into meaningful practice and really caring for educators as well. And so we've increasingly realized that really educators have a lot of healing to do, and educators have a lot of needs when it comes to talking about racism and disrupting racism. And so we have really focused a lot of our efforts on the educators and on people in different roles. So folks that are kind of tasked with being an equity lead, folks that are in leadership roles in schools or in kind of districts, and the different skills and knowledge sets that might require, and kind of the lived experiences and positionality and identities of those individuals, like how that shapes how they come to the work, and how kind of ready to receive some new ways of thinking they might be. This is all kind of playing into how we've been doing and refining kind of our work with educators. So we've been refining this intervention, and then we've also been trying to learn from current practice. And that's, I think, a really important direction, which I was just mentioning in my last response, which is that understanding, I love the term, the practice-based evidence. That's very similar to when I was saying the practice research gap. I think there's so much more that we have to learn from just the successes and of what's currently going on. So that is a big direction for us right now as well.
And I'll go back over to you, Malik. Again, thank you both. My mind goes everywhere when we're having these kinds of conversations, and in this moment, when I think restoration, my mind thinks, well, I need to be restored to something. But if we live in white supremacist systems where an identity that is separate from a subjugated, inferior, second-class humanity might have been erased over time, then how do we move forward to restoring? What are we restoring to when we're living in an overwhelmingly powerful system of white supremacy that would cause lots of people of color to believe that I just popped up into this world out of nothing, out of nowhere, with no past, with no history, um, with nothing that I can look back on to anchor myself in with a sense of pride. How do we engage in restoration, kind of working through systems that are designed to tell people who don't hold white identity that you're simply inferior in your humanity?
Yeah. I really like that. We ask that question a lot. So if we're engaged in this work of restorative practices, what is it that we're restoring young people and the rest of us into, or back into? But I do think if we take a step back for a moment, right? So the practices that we're talking about inherently have the seed and potential to be revolutionary, right? Especially in the hands of those of us that are trying to radically reimagine the world and push to do that. If we're not careful, though, there's inside of every organization, inside of every system, there's an immune system, right? That works just like every organism, and that is to reject foreign bodies, to reject change, right? To actively attack it, right? And so that's exactly what we have inside of schools, inside of other institutions that are rooted inside of hierarchy, white supremacy, and power. There's an immune system that will push back, right? So we can call that, we can name it resistance, et cetera, right? But then in the absence of that, at some point, that same immune system, in the absence of being able to completely reject, right, what it attempts to do is co-opt. And so that's precisely what I believe is the danger in a lot of this work, is that we must be always on the lookout for systems themselves attempting to co-opt and make over what has the potential to be revolutionary into reform, right? And so, for instance, with restorative practices, my restorative practices, it's really the activation of the truth that if human beings change their behavior based on their bonds and relationships, i.e., connection, right? If human beings change their behavior based on the bonds and relationships, then restorative practices, in a layman's way of thinking about it, is how do we leverage and lean into behavior, into bonds and relationships, in order to transform behavior, right? In ourselves, in others, right? So that requires us to build relationships, build connectedness through affective statements, proactive circles, right? Responsive questions, responsive circles, et cetera, et cetera. And so, for me, what I think about often is how something like restorative practices can be co-opted. So then it becomes a soft way for us to punish. It becomes punishment with a hug, right? But punishment nevertheless. And so we are encouraging, within the confines of our acceptable range of behavior, affective expression by young people, right? To be able to let us know when they've experienced harm, right? But not necessarily give them any power to be able to do anything about it. And really a soft way for them to apologize to adults who have also caused harm to them, but to apologize to those adults so that they can find ways to delve into grit and resilience, which just means grin and bear it. And so what we have the potential to do, and I guess I'll stop here, but the potential to do is really hold true to these practices, these healing practices, actions against racism, restorative practice, trauma-informed practices, to truly be revolutionary and disrupt hierarchies of power and dismantle them, and not to be co-opted. That's really what I'm interested in. I'm just really not interested in how do we create band-aids for the system to maintain its survival. Let's hasten its dismantling.
Word. Uh, uh, Kira, Danielle, let's talk about those systems and barriers. Um, I don't see this work as a work where systems that has spent the entirety of their existence trying to maintain and strengthen themselves. I don't see this work as work that's going to be um, passionately embraced by systems. Can you talk about barriers that might be related to systems and structures and institutions, and how you've attempted to navigate some of those barriers through actions against racism?
I can speak a little to some of that. I think one issue is that we tend to try to address racism in a lot of kind of piecemeal ways, even if they're kind of a system, it's like a piece of the system. So there's like, we're looking at discipline disparities, we're looking at achievement disparities, we're looking at absenteeism, we're looking at everything separately, we're looking at housing, we're looking at healthcare, when in reality, the root cause of all of this is this system, this bigger system of racism and oppression and white supremacy that has created all these different disparities, but we tend to kind of work on one at a time. And so I think that can cause just a lack of synergy and creativity and flexibility to actually really kind of change that system. At the same time, I think there's a lot of fear of change, that immune response, like we don't even know what different looks like. So how can we possibly handle that? So what I really like about some decisions that we've made with Actions Against Racism is just the name. It's harder to co-opt, I think. And I think that's part of what, I had, when we were first starting this work, a few people asked me, would you like to change the name? And I was like, absolutely not. That is the entire point. And when we say we do a project called Actions Against Racism, or that's our team, people know what we're trying to do. We're not trying to sneak anything by them. And so I think that's also helpful. I think just the name does something. Credit to Kira.
Well, I would say that's a joint thing, because I think the original name was Action Against Racism and then changed it to Actions. And so kind of to put that there's no one action against this and doing this work. And to piggyback off of what Danielle said, is just like there are so many of these policies and practices that are just so biased and outdated. Well, not outdated, I feel like they were built in for the purpose that they were. And I feel like that so many people are interested in doing this work, but there is, as Danielle was saying, that there's this fear to say something or speak out. And there's this rigidity that kind of comes and lack of flexibility that does come up with doing this. I feel like leadership has been like one of the barriers. I think that there are so many people on the ground levels and in the schools that are wanting to do this work, motivated to do this, but thinking about where's the funding coming from, what's leadership's like with holding people accountable for doing this work. And so I think the amount of bureaucracy that comes in doing this with every institution you're at is a huge barrier. And then I think for the people who are truly motivated for kind of doing this work in the school systems, they have limited bandwidth. They have so many other responsibilities that they have to do that is just like, how am I also going to be doing this? And how can I be making sure I'm incorporating into all the other things? And I think when we've been meeting with the equity leads, that's been a number one thing, is just like feeling burnt out because they don't have the support, or that they have a limited bandwidth because they are trying to do so many other things. And I think that goes for people clinically as well, outside of school systems too.
And Kira, if I can just big up something that you said there right from the beginning, and that is, it's not action, it's actions, right? And so pluralizing that is so important. What it's doing is resisting the notion for the single cure, for the panacea, right? And what educators and clinicians were always looking for were goblins for a practice. Right? Like, just give me a practice, right? If I can go to a training and get one thing, right, that I can go and implement tomorrow, right, then it feels like it's all worth it, except there is no single practice, right? And what we often say is that if someone comes before the masses and suggests and puts forth that there's this one thing that you can do that will solve all of your woes, that person should be booed off the stage because they're a con man trying to sell snake oil. There is no single thing. Right. And if it was, it would be so generic as to not be helpful. Like, we just need to love the kids. Let's just love them. All right, that's cute. Right. But how do we operationalize that in June when we don't want to love them? We want to choke them. Right. So how do we really help folks understand that this is a complex problem that needs a comprehensive solution that we need to put together, right, in a cocktail way, just like we have for all of the greatest issues, right? The fight against cancer is not a single thing, it's a cocktail approach, right? And so we need to be thinking about it in that broad way as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I'm watching where we are, recognizing that we have uh, a good mix of folks who are here, representing different identities, different experiences, different roles, different positions. Uh, and so I don't even know how to phrase this question, but if we are to, if we are to have a call to action to someone sitting in this room, and again, I'm just making some assumptions based on names and faces that we represent such a wide range of experiences and perspectives. But if you were to have a call to action for those who might have registered and they're going to watch it later, they're not here right now. Can you each just kind of share what that call would be? And then I want to open up to those who have been listening to share perspectives. I see a comment in the chat, which is also a really powerful comment, and I see that we won't let that one slide. We'll highlight that, but I want to give you each time uh, to share your thoughts on the call to action for those who are here or might be watching this later on.
Yeah, I'll start. I think something I would want to highlight, I think coming from a white identity, coming from a place of privilege when we're talking about systems of white supremacy, I think it's important to not rush to the kumbaya moment. I think that there is a tendency to kind of avoid thinking about the harm and some of the things that we've talked about today, kind of centering that harm, and that by rushing to kind of healing and kumbaya and we're all going to be better, sometimes that can be dismissive, well-intentioned, but dismissive. So I think just in thinking about healing and repairing harm, I think that looks like kind of centering relationships and centering the humanity of kind of everyone involved. And that may mean kind of going slower than may feel comfortable. So that's my call to action.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And I want to, yeah, I see that Kira, you've unmuted, so share yours, please.
Sure. To kind of piggyback off of Dane, I feel like we do this so often. It's just thinking about with a call to action, I feel like there is, and what Malik was saying, there's no like right size kind of call to action for everyone. And so I think the overall call to action that I would say is just like taking some sort of action. And what that looks like is going to look different. It might be continuing to just educate yourself. It might be speaking out. It might be going to protest, writing kind of your congressman. I think taking some sort of action on this kind of like journey. I think myself, I've been kind of like working on just amplifying those voices and experiences with those who might be kind of like discounted and speaking up when I see something. And I think just even speaking up and showing people that you hear them, you see them, can be really powerful. And I'm gonna say I have not been perfect in this, and I've caused some harm along the way. And I think even with causing harm, I think it's also something that I've been using to kind of like motivate myself to just do better, but not stopping myself from taking some sort of action.
Yeah, I really like that. I'm thinking about two calls, and one of them is I think we need a broad emphasis and focus on organization and organizations. Organization has always been the path towards liberation, and organizations are the preeminent structure that's always been at the backbone of radical and serious change. And so I think we need to increase the internal capacity of organizations, DPA included, right? Organizations to be able to do this work. And then I think the other call is that I think we have a real responsibility, especially those of us within some of this work directed at schools, those of us that have non-instructional responsibility, I think we have a moral obligation to cross-map how all of these initiatives tie together, right? Understand the synergy, because our educators cannot hold one more thing, right? So this too is just another thing, right? Whatever this is. And so what we have to do, I think, is do the hard work of cross mapping and understanding the harmony and the complementarity of the work, so that this isn't one more thing for them to lift up, but this is just how we do school. This is how we do community. Yeah.
Beautiful. Beautiful. And I want to take a moment. So there's this comment in the chat. Well, you all can read the chat. I'm not sure that we live amidst an overwhelmingly powerful system. This was mentioned a bit earlier. We live amongst a system that is organized in a particular way that the people it affects are not. I think it's important because we otherwise feel we are living under circumstances that are insurmountable. Ultimately, Dr. Muhammad's statements become really critical then to understand when he mentions a revolutionary response over reform. It's not sufficient to that Band-Aid approach. And I'm really thinking even back to the history of the different approaches that folks have taken to try to liberate Black people. There are those who were, very much kind of strong assimilationists who believe, well, let's just educate them, make them a little bit whiter somehow, and then that'll be the solution. Versus those who are about abolitionists who are like, actually, let's break down the system. Because nothing short of full freedom, nothing short of full liberation is acceptable. It's not enough. It's not enough to say make you like the system, but to free you from the system. And I want to give those who want to share a thought or a question for our panelists a chance to either unmute yourself or place something in the chat.
Roger, if I can just really quick mention something here. What I think is important for us to remember is that these systems, these institutions, these structures are man-made. Emphasis on man. They are not natural. This is not the natural order of things, right? And so because they are man-made, they could be dismantled and reimagined, and in new systems that are woman and man-made, right? By our own hands, that we bring about liberation ourselves. And so if we recognize that they're not insurmountable because they were created by man, that they can be reimagined, and we can create a new future made by women and men. Yeah.
Beautifully stated. I think we've got Dr. Bocanegra in the chat highlighting how the struggle is designed. And so whenever someone calls for freedom, there's someone else who sits somewhere in a position of power that's saying ignorance is the way. And that's a whole other hour to talk about how, for those who are striving to do this work, do we sustain that pushback against systems that are trying, like you said, these are human systems that are pushing back in a really dynamic way. And that's a whole other conversation. I'm grateful that you brought that into the chat. Anyone else? Anyone here who'd like to chime in? You've been sitting, you've been listening, but you wanted to highlight something before we end our program for this evening.
So I could jump in. Thank you, panelists. You've been amazing. And, I'm thinking about this piece around coping with racism. So there's like these 5 pillars that you explained. And one is coping with racism. And when we think about and Roger, you were talking about this, like dismantling racism, and there's this assaulted sense of self. You didn't say that word, but Dr. Kenneth Hardy, he's a Black psychologist out of Philly, I think in New York too. He talks about for children, when they're exposed to racism and we're in a racist system, it kind of like shatters these assumptions about ourselves, and it can assault your sense of self. This notion of being damaged goods, right? And so as we think about these pillars, I'm really curious, like, what does coping with racism look like as we're trying to repair this harm? What might that look like? Malik, you can answer that too. I'm talking about them. I know, you think about this too. I'm just curious, especially if, people, even if you're not in education, but you're working with your own children and having these conversations, like what might that look like?
Yeah, I can kind of talk a little bit more about that. I think with like being faced with racial encounters, I think one part of that is that racial socialization thing that is really important. And so the messages that our children are receiving about race, racism, kind of their own value and worth, we've noticed that there's a lot of work that's done with thinking about the ones that have like effects on children and that actually impact just school performance and also just like well-being for children. And so emphasizing more of those powerful messages that people might be seeing. So like culturally affirming messages like racial pride, things like that are really important. But we also know that in some encounters, it's about kind of like reframing kind of the thoughts that are coming along when you're faced with that. So that kind of incorporates some of that evidence-based practice where it's just like thinking about, okay, what are some of the appraisals of the situations that the child is getting? And this is from the work, some of the work of Howard Stevenson. It's just like, how can we reframe those thoughts and recast those thoughts and kind of like move away from things saying it's something about me that's defective in this situation, and like how can we reframe it as just like that's on that person. So it's not that I'm bad because someone is following me around in the store, or that my teacher is kind of like sending me to the office more so than other people. It's something about that teacher or that person that is kind of like so, and there's a system that's in place and kind of working with them to kind of change some of that. And then also just noticing that like it does take a toll on our bodies when we are kind of experiencing these racial encounters. And so how can we be taking care of ourselves and our bodies in those moments, and really kind of like healing through some of the stress and things that come along with race and racism through body focused practices and strategies too.
Beautiful.
Thank you. Very helpful.
Indeed.
Are you
And,
still?
Please go ahead.
My name is James Burton. Dr.
Yes,
Muhammad,
please. We're going to spend about 3 more minutes, so you get to go. You get to go. Please share please chime in.
I lived through the racism system. I'm still living through it now. And as we, as African Americans and as European Americans, I heard the statement where we don't know what it looked like, and we do know what it looked like, and we know what it feels like because we continue to facilitate that kind of mindset and that kind of separatism among us. But let me say that so many systems that are in place that hinder that change in terms of we as African Americans, and we always, every 10 or 15 years, the name changes. It might be colored, African American, might be black, whatever, but based on the systems, it hinder us from moving forward as to where we should be, because we always have to adapt to the systems that are currently being put in place or currently that are in place. So my point to you is that this race thing is here, and we as African American, black, colored, whatever we wish to be called, have to show more collective work together. We talk about restored practices. We talk about the village. We talk about that. That is what we, as people of color, the brown skin, have to work in terms of bringing that back together. So therefore, we can resolve and perhaps dismantle some of those systems that's currently in place.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much for highlighting that power of the collective. I really appreciate it. And I want to just kind of pause right here in this moment to express gratitude to each of you who's taken the time so graciously to join this journey. If this is the first, the second, or the third time that you sat in this space, Much appreciation to all of you. I really, really want to express gratitude to our panelists tonight, to Christina and the rest of the Diversity Committee for the planning, for reaching out to these outstanding contributors. Kelly, to you for being such a constant support in the background for this kind of programming. And we heard you loud and clear, Malik, about DPA as an organization using our voice, using our resources, using our people, our time, and our expertise to contribute to the solution. So thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. More programming will follow, so you'll see us on the mailing list. Really grateful to each of you. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
so much.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
everyone.
everyone. Thank you.